You've tuned in to the #Lita podcast, where love is the answer. Before we get started today, I wanted to tell you just a little bit about my podcasting experience and encourage you to start one for yourself if you've been thinking about it. If you haven't heard about Anchor, it's the easiest way to make a podcast. Let me explain. First of all, it's free. Yes, free. Second, there's creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. Third, Anchor will distribute your podcast for you. You don't have to do a thing, and it can be heard on many different podcast platforms like Spotify, Apple Podcast, and Google. Finally, you can make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. It's everything you need to make a podcast all in one place. Super easy. So download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. That's anchor.fm, ANCHOR.FM.
You are listening to the #Lita podcast, hosted by author, speaker, and coach Jeff Connor. He invites you each week as he has conversations to discover how others are using love to change the world. Listen in and find what inspires love within you, so you can go out and share it with the world. Remember, love is the answer.
I have a dream today.
Hello to you, my friend, and welcome to the #Lita podcast, where love is the answer. My name is Jeff Connor, and I will be your host on our hour together this week, talking to a fabulous guest and doing our best to demonstrate and provide examples of how love really is the answer. I'd like to ask you to do me a favor and give me a little bit of your love. Two ways you can do that right off the bat. One is go to the website for this podcast, www.litaforlife.com. That's LITAFORLIFE.com, and subscribe so you can get the Take 5 Friday newsletter that I put out each Friday, where you'll get an introduction to our upcoming guest, links to our previous guest, as well as some information on books I'm reading, cool people that I've discovered, and interesting quotes that I'm thinking about that particular week. So again, go over to www.litaforlife.com and subscribe so that you can get that. The second thing I'd like for you to do to help me out and show some love for this show and help us build the community is whichever platform you're listening to right now, leave a review on it. Leave a review. Let me know, let others know what you think of this podcast and the programming, what you think of me. Whether you agree, disagree with anything we're saying, it's a great way to get the conversation going and also help to build this community. And then engage with us on Facebook or the other social media, Twitter, and things like that. Those links are all in the show notes. Go on there and start sharing this, share it with your friends, and let's just build this community up and start making a big difference in this world and showing to everyone how love is the answer. So go ahead, press pause. I will wait for you and be here when you come back. Go ahead and leave that review and like us on Facebook. Whatever you can do to help promote this show would be greatly appreciated. So pause, and I will be here when you come back. Thank you so much for taking the time to help support this show. Really appreciate it. I want to dive in now and introduce this week's guest, Tim Grimes. It was a real treat for me to talk to Tim because of how much I enjoyed his book, The Joy of Not Thinking, A Radical Approach to Happiness. I loved that book because it gave me a practical guide to help me with one of my biggest challenges, which is silencing my monkey mind. You know, my monkey mind tends to run in overdrive all the time, and I go from thoughts of judging everything to becoming hyper-vigilant where I think there's danger all around me. My thoughts are just a random hodgepodge of nonsense most of the time. I'm curious, do you feel that way as well? If you're like me, you've maybe tried meditation to help you stop thinking, and you probably get frustrated just like I do. Because of those of us who have tried meditation know you can never really stop thinking by just being still. So in his book, Tim, he understands this, and he outlines some very creative and fun ideas to help us become active and get into these kind of goofy and playful ways as being the key to stopping our thoughts. Tim and I, we have a really great wide-ranging conversation that touches on psychology, spirituality, and religion. I think a lot of you are starting to see how that's part of my journey, so that's showing up a lot. But he also gives us some ideas on some great books to read as we discuss the law of attraction and how we can apply the law of attraction to manifest what we truly want in our lives. We also touch on the motivation of proclaimed self-help gurus as we ponder whether they are really in it to help people or to build their own personal wealth. I think you're really going to enjoy and get a lot out of our hour-long talk. Here's a bit more on Tim to whet your appetite. Tim Grimes is a coach, speaker, and writer of multiple best-selling guides on stress management, including The Joy of Not Thinking and Relax More, Try Less. Tim's focus is on simplifying the stress reduction process for anyone who is interested. He has been called the guru of taking it easy because his approach manages to be profoundly simple yet effective. Tim is also an acclaimed editor of classic law and attraction works by Emile Coué and Neville Goddard, and specializes in exploring the link between relaxation and the law of attraction. For more information about Tim and his work, you can visit www.radicalcounselor.com. So without any further delay, let's go ahead and dive into our discussion. Enjoy. Tim, welcome to the #LEADA podcast. I'm happy to have you with me today.
Thank you for having me, Jeff.
Yeah, delighted. I always start off the show asking guests, because the $1 million question is, what's love got to do with it? So the question that I want to pose to you right off the bat to get our conversation going is, what's your work, what you're doing in the world? I found you by reading your book, The Joy of Not Thinking, A Radical Approach to Happiness. But if you could just give folks who maybe haven't read that book a little bit of background on you and then tie it into, because I can see the connection with love, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Sure. So what I mainly do is write and edit books that deal with the body-mind relationship. And I like to write and talk about stuff that most people don't seem to notice about how our bodies and minds interact and work together or don't work together. So I guess you could call it alternative stress management is what I'm interested in. And I tend to come from a rather, I guess you would say, spiritual viewpoint. I use the word spiritual loosely. I just can't think of a better word to describe what I tend to talk about, because it does get kind of spiritual quickly. And the spiritual aspect is probably what brings it together with the loving aspect, because in my opinion, one of the hardest things that we have to learn to do, and it's a learning process, is we have to learn how to love ourselves. And I find that many of us, especially those of us who have worked on ourselves in self-development, get better at forgiving others and loving others. But we have often the hardest time forgiving ourselves and actually loving ourselves. And it's a continual process. So in a nutshell, that's what I talk about a lot of the time and how that relates to love. And basically everything I do is focused on making us more aware of who we are and how we can love ourselves more by being more open and accepting of just being who we are, as opposed to trying to be somebody else.
Yeah, I really like that, and there's a lot to unpack in all of what you just said. I wanted to hone in just a little bit, because I think when I look at even my own journey in personal development and growth, I am in complete agreement with you on that spirituality component being such a foundation for my own growth. But you made a comment that you say it spiritual viewpoint, you say that loosely. And so for me, it's been a real journey that hasn't ended. I'm still on that spiritual journey of discovery. What do you mean, I guess, by loosely? And because I think that could be helpful to a lot of folks, as they're looking at their own personal development and looking to grow spiritually. Sometimes I think spirituality and religion get a little overlap too much. And I don't know
I
how you
agree.
think about that, but I'd be curious just what your viewpoint is on the spirituality and spiritual growth.
Yeah, that's a great question. And honestly, we could spend this whole podcast just discussing this because I find it pretty fascinating because it's so misunderstood, I think, a lot of the time. Spirituality and religion are extremely loaded words, as is love. But I would say religion has, for a lot of us, kind of almost negative connotations because many of us were brought up in situations where we were felt like we were kind of forced to be religious, meaning that we had to go to, church or temple or something like that. And it was something that we grew up with and we didn't necessarily feel aligned with, meaning that we didn't want to do it. To say nothing of, various religious factions fighting each other for, throughout history over religion in the name of God or what have you. So religion's not a word I like to use as much as spirituality, but it is pointing at the same thing. Um, Spirituality, I would say, is being in touch with who you are in the sense of realizing that there is something beyond your normal conception of yourself. So, you know, you're not just Jeff, I'm not just Tim, but there's something else going on here besides just our rational conception of who we are. And that's the spiritual journey. What's so confusing about using the word spirituality is that it's vague because it's an internal process of feeling better being who you are, as I said earlier. And spirituality from an individual process is not like it's not like a religion. It's like you go to church and that makes you a religious person. But a spiritual person is somebody who is touching the heart of who they are. And that's not something that you just do on Sunday or just do, 5 minutes each day. That's a continual, lifelong process of being in touch with who you are in a deep sense. And if you're able to touch that part of you, that deeper part of you, it inevitably, in my experience, connects you with everything else. If you want to call it God or the source or whatever you want to call it, it's something inherent in all of us. And what's interesting is because spirituality is such an overused term, in my opinion, or such a general term, um, we connotate it with things that I think are actually counterproductive to feeling happy. Like we believe we have to become a more spiritual person. And I don't even know what that actually means.
Yeah.
So I know this is kind of a confusing answer because it's a very confusing subject, but what I have noticed over my years, because I've always been interested in my quote unquote spiritual journey, meaning that when I was even just a teenager, I was very into Eastern religion, into Zen Buddhism and things like that. And, when I got into college and stuff like that, Zen and Eastern religion was really where a lot of my focus was. Um, but what's confusing is that even when you're doing an individual search for spirituality and becoming quote unquote more spiritual, at least in my journey, there were so many wrong turns and so many things that guided me in the wrong way. And I realize now that most of these things that people were labeling as being spiritual were actually psychological concepts. It was all basically psychology that was given spiritual names. And so when I say the word spiritual loosely, where I'm loosely talking about spirituality, it's because mainly I would say when I'm talking about are actually just psychological principles or psychological theories that are really underappreciated. And they're so underappreciated that we usually connotate them with spirituality and religion as opposed to psychology.
Do you
Now, this
have
is
an example of something that would be more psychological than spiritual, that just to give us a little context?
yeah, of course. I would say um, that well, I would first say virtually everything that is used that we use spiritual terms for we could use psychological terms instead. But to give you a specific example, um, a lot of the time when people say like that they are, that they have to let go, and letting go is seen as like this spiritual act. And really what letting go is just psychologically stop not being rational for a moment. Giving yourself that psychological space not to see something from your normal rational perspective. People say, oh, I'm looking at it from a spiritual perspective. Really, they're just not looking at it from their normal rational perspective. Does that make any sense, Jeff? I feel like I'm giving very kind of complicated answers to your question, because it's a complicated issue as far as I'm concerned, and a very important issue.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I don't think that it's too complicated, because like what you said, it is complicated, and a couple of things that come to mind. One is um, around this idea of letting go, and stop being rational, and I hear what you say about the psychological component of that. What came to mind when you said that, though, too, for me, and tying it into spirituality, is that when we let go, I think there has to be a trust then, or a faith in something bigger than ourselves, that we can let go and still be okay. And so I don't know, if that's a purely psychological endeavor. Maybe it is, because this idea of the universe taking care of me, I guess, is a thought, right?
That's a good example, actually, right there too. So I'm usually terrible at thinking of specific examples off the top of my head. But if we just talk about this stuff, we'll come up with a bunch of examples.
Yeah, perfect.
Because like that's just pure psychology. Um, so in other words, if somebody is going through life thinking, oh, I have to do it alone, I have to figure out how everything's going to work rationally. And then they come across a spiritual teaching, whatever it may be. And it's basically saying, you know what, the universe will take care of you. God will take care of you, or whatever kind of spiritual language we use. They then allow themselves psychologically more space to get out of their own way. Now, when you actually get out of your own way, whether you approach it psychologically or spiritually, in terms of wording, it doesn't matter. I would say, do you actually need faith to let go? If you really rationally get, the joy of not thinking, I talk about this a lot. If you get out of your own way physically by momentarily just stopping taking yourself so seriously, then you don't need any faith to do that. It just happens naturally throughout the day. Actually, we sometimes just like default to where we have faith and have just let go, but we only do it for brief periods of time, and it usually doesn't amount to anything because we are overwhelmed by our thinking. But you don't need faith to let go. It happens every night when you go to sleep. I mean, eventually you go to sleep, and guess what? You just let go, and that didn't take any faith. That was just your physiology, naturally doing something.
Yeah, I suppose that at some point, even if you didn't have the faith that you'd wake up in the morning, your body is going to physiologically just not be able to stay awake anymore, and it's going to
Exactly.
go on its own. So no, I hear what you're saying. So, and I think that's I think you bring up a fascinating part of it, and that's one of the things that really came up in my mind too as you were talking, especially about learning to love yourself, is just how important it is. One of my favorite mentors, that I've learned a lot from, is Tony Robbins, and he said one time, and it stuck with me forever: you can't give what you don't have. So when I think about love, if we don't have love in us for ourselves, it's really hard for us to give away, to truly give away. Now we can act it, and I think that a lot of people can put on good acts of love and kindness, um, but I don't think we're giving it away at the highest level if we don't figure out how to love ourselves.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And I think that it's impossible to actually sustainably give love if you don't feel love within yourself, to yourself. It's all interconnected in that way. We're a mirror. So how we view ourselves and treat ourselves is a mirror for how we're going to treat our world.
Yeah, you say that word mirror, and it reminds me, because I saw a quote as I was reading through The Joy of Not Thinking, and I won't be able to find it now, but at the top of one of your chapters, you had a Byron Katie quote, and I think she's pretty big on that concept of what you just said.
Yeah, I mean, she's one of my favorite teachers, if not my favorite teacher. And I mean, she's just so good at making you realize that whatever you're thinking is affecting your life, but what you're thinking is not necessarily true. It's not this concrete thing. It's malleable. It can change. So yes, we can treat ourselves much more lovingly. She has a great Byron Katie has a book. I think the title is "I Need Your Love." Is that true? And that cuts right to it. That's what we're discussing right now.
I'm gonna say. Can you say the name of that book again?
I believe it's called "I Need Your Love." Is that true? Or something along those lines. It has a title like that. It's got a very provocative title.
Okay, I'll look that up and make sure to put that in the show notes. I'm always looking for new books and liking to recommend them to the listeners out there. So,
Well, I'll give you two more if you want. And
yeah, I love that.
All of Byron Katie's stuff is great, and I hope that your listeners, if they don't know who she is, check her out, because she's just awesome. And there's just so much to explore with her stuff. But probably I would say my two favorite books of all time, or the two books that have been most helpful to me in my personal journey and like in learning how to love myself more. One of them is by Byron Katie. It's called 1,000 Names for Joy. And that in that book, her husband actually has translated a lot of classic Eastern works, and he translated the Tao Te Ching, which is a classic book by Lao Tzu that's thousands of years old. And she gives commentary on the principles of that book, and it's just the most amazing spiritual book I've ever read. And there I am using the word spirituality. and actually, just to go back for a quick moment, then I'll give you my other book recommendation. I say all that stuff kind of about spirituality being overused and the language being overused. I say that being someone who I would consider myself very spiritual, and I would say that essentially what I'm talking about is spiritual stuff. I'm just saying that we have to make sure we don't get too wrapped up in the language. So in other words, like if the universe isn't helping you, then stop believing the universe is helping you. That's just a word. It doesn't matter. We can get deeper than spiritual language often lets us get. There's more to it. So 1,000 Names for Joy is a great spiritual book that shows you that. And then the other book recommendation that I would give is this book that's about 100 years old. It's called Self-Mastery Through Conscious Autosuggestion. It's a mouthful right there.
Self-mastery through
conscious autosuggestion.
Conscious autosuggestion. Yeah, that's a mouthful.
It's by Emile Coué, who was a famous French, I guess today we would call him a psychologist, basically. He was basically a healer. And I've actually edited a book of some of his classic works called Simple Self-Healing, which is just a collection of some of his work. But his original work, his most famous book, is called Self-Mastery Through Conscious Autosuggestion. And this is the person, in my opinion, that will show you that most of these things that we think are spiritual concepts and have to do with God and have to do with, giving yourself to God or something like that, that all this stuff is really just psychological principles, psychological processes that we're all going through, and that we don't necessarily have to lump all these spiritual terms and get so, worked up about, am I being spiritual enough about this stuff, and that we're just dealing with ourselves psychologically, and how can we better deal with ourselves psychologically. Emile Coué is another person who's just a master at helping you do that, in my opinion.
Yeah, I'm going to definitely be checking out both of those books, and I'll make sure, and your book too. That sounds really, really cool to, kind of see what you've written, in that Simple Self-Healing book. So I'm excited to check that out, because all of these things really, start to have that impact, and they change, I think, over time, the way that I know they've changed the way that I've thought, and where I've come from in my spiritual journey as one who needed initially a lot of the dogma around religion and a lot of, advice from people and people telling me what to do and how to do it, to now where it's become very internal and very personal. And I'm looking to more have those personal experiences of spirituality, from within, rather than looking on the outside of me. And I think that a lot of that, I know Byron Katie, her work is always about inside, because like you said, what we see on the outside is a mirror. Her turnaround question, when somebody is ignoring us, it's when she turns it around, well, you're ignoring people, or you're ignoring that person. And we start to see the truth in that as we start breaking it down through her four questions of the work.
Yeah, I mean, it's again, she's just great. For your listeners who don't know her, Byron Katie's she's the real deal. I mean, quite honestly, I'm pretty skeptical of a lot of modern self-help teachers a lot of the time. And I'm going to be 40 in a few months. And in my 20s, I spent a lot of time checking out various self-help teachers, and I became very disillusioned. And Byron Katie's the real deal. That's all I have to say about that.
I'm curious, because a lot of folks, including myself, I'm just curious what makes you skeptical, and what led you to become disillusioned by a lot of these because one of the things, I was talking to somebody recently about Tony Robbins, who's one of these help gurus out there, and it is, he's a billionaire, right? And he makes a lot of money doing what he does. And so, is what he's doing true and authentic, or is he doing it to build his wealth? And that's where my question, I'm just curious where your question might come in on some of these self-help folks.
This all dovetails perfectly. I don't think I'm using the term dovetails right, but that's okay. So to backtrack briefly, because this is a great question, similar to what you were speaking about in terms of needing examples outwardly of like, in religious teachers, spiritual teachings gave good outward examples. When I was in my 20s, I needed good outward examples of how to like take action, like in terms of self-help stuff. And even when I was younger, I needed good outward examples of like how to like access my spiritual side, I think, a little bit. And that's what like Zen teachings did for me when I was a teenager. And I mean, yeah, this isn't a great, Tony Robbins is a great example, because I read Tony's books in my 20s, and they were mind blowing. A lot of the stuff he said, and a lot of the things he says, really profoundly affected me, and have really affected me to this day. For instance, The Joy of Not Thinking, I have a whole section where I just talk about playful movement. And basically, I'm talking about changing your state. And that's exactly what Tony Robbins has always talked about.
Yeah.
And he is one of the few teachers who I remember like really talking about that, and like talking about it in a way where it wasn't like a one-off thing, but he consistently talked about how to physically do this. So he had a profound impact on my own life, like without question. And it's, you know, the short answer to what you're asking is it's very gray. Like, is Tony just doing it for money? I don't think so. But is his teaching as pure as maybe it was when he was, you know, teaching 30 years ago? Maybe not, probably not. I can tell you, I saw him in person a couple of years ago, at an event, and it wasn't like one of his Date with Destiny events. It was like a smaller Daylon event, and um, it was mainly bullshit. But when he actually got on stage and spoke, he was right on. Like when he actually was there, you know, like doing his thing, and it was just him talking. He still had it, in my opinion, in many ways. But um, there's so much other stuff to distract you, I guess is what I'm saying. And when you start this journey, I think you have to deal with those distractions in some ways, because you need to get the information or the ideas, and inevitably there's going to be a lot of bells and whistles that go with that in all likelihood. But then, as you said, the longer you do it, the more you can parse down, and you realize that, you know what, a lot of this stuff I just don't need. Like, it's not, what are the things that help me feel better about myself? What are the things that help me be more loving towards others and myself? What are the things that can, you know, make me have better relationships, or bring me a better job, or improve my health? And you can parse down, and that is the continual process that we're talking about, Jeff, where it's not just something that happens over 3 months or a year or 2 years, and that so many self-help books talk about, where change your life in 6 months. I mean, that's bullshit. You can change your life in 6 months, but then you're going to keep on changing your life. You know what I mean? Over and over again.
Yeah, yeah. Constantly evolving, I guess would be a good way to say that.
Yeah, that's just natural. That's
yeah.
how, you know, it works.
Yeah. Interesting that you went to see Tony Robbins live. I went to one of his, it was a week-long
Right.
thing, Business Mastery, out in Las Vegas back in 2017. And you're right, when he's on stage and he's doing his thing, it's powerful, it's masterful, and he has a way of connecting with people, and getting, and he did that. You know, I remember going there, I had no idea what to expect. I'd never done anything with Tony Robbins. I'd really just learned about him about 8 months prior to, because I watched that Netflix I'm Not
Yes.
Your Guru show.
Right.
And
Yeah.
it doesn't give you a real glimpse, but when you walk in, you know, this Business Mastery, it was probably about 3,000 people in a big room. And they're all typically, just about everybody was a business owner, and you've got some very wealthy people and some people that are just starting out. It's interesting to see the gamut, but he did, you know, and I want to get into a little bit of that. Maybe this will be a great way to segue, is because you drew that correlation between, you know, the body movement and stop being serious. And he just did that. You know, you would go in and he had dancers on stage, and they would be leading you, you know, the entire room in a dance and loud music, and just
Exactly.
getting us, like you teach, out of our heads. And what was interesting, at first, he would have us turn and give massages to complete strangers in the room. It was weird at first. And for the first couple of days, you know, I was with a crowd that was really into it. And one day I decided I wanted to sit a little bit differently, and meet some new people. So I sat down in an empty row, and then it filled in around me. And they were not into it. So they didn't get up and dance. And my experience that day was, I guess, disappointment would be the best word. And he's long immersive training, so these are like 15, 18-hour days.
Yes. Yeah.
I was so tired by not doing it, you know, and the people around me weren't doing it. So that at the lunch break, I remember going back and finding the folks that I had been with up to that point, and then got back on track. So I think you're making that correlation between what you teach in the Joy of Not Thinking with moving that body. Let's talk about that a little bit. The not thinking piece, because that is, I mean, I talk to people about, you know, thinking, not thinking, controlling our thoughts, being in charge of our thoughts. And for a long time in my own life, I thought, that's ridiculous. There's no way that we can I'm not in control of my thoughts, which I've learned, now how false that was. But I got to imagine there's a lot of folks out there that probably feel like I do.
Oh yeah. I mean, we do not understand how our thinking works whatsoever. And what's so interesting is that, and this is what I'm really into, and what Tony Robbins helped show me, like helped make the conscious connection for me. What I'm really into is showing people that if you just behave ridiculously and playfully for like a minute or two, if you can really just genuinely get up and start jumping around and making silly noises, or just clapping your hands or barking like a dog, and just move around like a wacky, ridiculous person, if you can do that for just a few minutes, just giving all of your physical effort to do that, then you will realize that your thinking is an illusion, in the sense that it's not what you believed it was. Tony Robbins talks about it being, changing your state. And that's exactly what happens, is if you get truly playful, something like, you realize you are not who you think you are. There is so much more going on. And the other stuff that's going on is what is, that's love right there. The other stuff that's going on, in the sense of that is what you really are, physiologically, mentally, spiritually. And it's hard for me on a podcast to describe exactly what I mean when I say getting playful. In The Joy of Not Thinking, I go over it some. I have a free video series called Stop Being Serious. Go to stopbeingserious.com, where I show physical examples of what we're talking about. And I literally mean, if you can become really playful for a short period of time, it can really change your emotional state quickly.
Yeah, I read your book. That's been a couple of 2, 3, 4 weeks ago, I suppose, that I read it, and I really connected to this idea, because I've tried on and off over the years to meditate, which is, I think, one of the practices that gets taught a lot to help us to. Some would say, I guess, the goal of meditation is to stop thinking, in that mindfulness, transcendental.
Yeah, we can. Meditation is a very, very difficult for a lot of people, and totally taught in a foolish way. And this is what I mean about spiritual concepts. Like, people are approaching meditation from a spiritual, quote unquote, spiritual viewpoint, and they're wasting their time a lot of the time.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, because this idea of, even if you're focusing, like they tell you, stop. I know mindfulness is pay attention to your breathing and just focus. Well, you're still thinking about it, right? While
Exactly.
you're doing that. And
exactly.
I think where a lot of people, and I know I did early on, is we judge the quality of our meditation, and we have some goal in mind of what meditation is supposed to do for us. And I think that's where we kind of get stuck in it, is that I know for me, I'm not supposed to be thinking, yet I'm thinking. I can't figure this out. I'm no good at this, and I get frustrated with it. And part of what meditation is to kind of take that step back from your thinking. At least this is my understanding, is step back from it and just be able to observe, be the observer of your thoughts, and recognize that you're not your thoughts, by becoming that observer and seeing how this stream of thoughts, you'll never shut them off. However, your way, and I've done this. I've walked down I go for walks almost every day now, and I find myself getting in my head sometimes, overthinking while I'm walking. And I've literally stopped that and just started walking goofily down the road. People driving by probably think I've lost my mind, and I'll just kind of start going blah, 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 just being goofy. And I'll do that for a minute or so walking down the road. But in that minute, I've totally stopped really thinking. I don't worry about what people think, and I'm just having fun, and I get done with that and I'm in a different state. I'm not in that serious place anymore. And I think that is so powerful. And what really drew me to the joy of not thinking was that method. We don't have to sit and meditate for 10, 20, 30, an hour, or whatever to experience this non-thinking, these non-thinking moments, and feel totally okay in that moment when we're not thinking.
Yeah, and sometimes honestly feel better than just totally okay.
Yeah.
Like sometimes, like, dare I say it, connect with God.
Yeah.
In that playfulness and movement where we just lose ourselves for a minute. And again, I use connect with God just because I don't know, I could use a psychological term, I guess, like, I don't like deep contentment or something like that. Or like a total satiation of desire or something like that. I don't know. But I have a backstory about why I say that about meditation. I love to meditate now, okay? But I meditated since I was 16, 17 years old. I lived at a Zen Buddhist center for a year. I meditated every day of my life, just about for, I think, 12 years. And I got, during that time, from like a time I was probably 17 years old till I was about 30, I would say I got pretty much nothing from meditating. And as a Zen practitioner at that time, I would say that was the point. That if you want to get real Zen, like that's like Zen meditation, that is the point. Nothing to gain, nothing to lose. And that's what, the great Zen teachers that I liked then and that I still do like, that's what they would say. But when I was around 30 years old, I was on vacation and I was like, I'm just not going to meditate today. I'm just going to try it. And I didn't meditate. And I felt okay. And the next day I said, yeah, the rest of the vacation, I just won't meditate. And I, needless to say, I didn't meditate the rest of that week. And then I just stopped. And Jeff, there was no difference in my life from when I was meditating before to when I stopped meditating in the way I had been meditating, because I was doing, like you said, I was just sitting there and just sitting, being aware of my thoughts. And sometimes there would be very few thoughts and it would be very clear. And sometimes it would be very stressful and anxious, blah, blah, blah. But it was just up and down, just the waves coming and going. And that's cool. I'm all for that. But when I hear people talking about meditating in the way that we're talking about right now to improve their lives, I am here to tell you, you're not going to improve your life by doing this, by meditating like that, in my opinion, at least. It's not a self-improvement technique in the way that people think it is. There are other ways to meditate, which are more aligned with loving yourself, that are different than this. But the way most people are taught to meditate, which is this kind of mindful, just watch those shitty thoughts go by and I'm the same. It's just, in my opinion, for most people, it's a waste of time. And there's better things you can do to make yourself feel better.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that, for me, I don't, and I think you just said that you meditate differently now. And I think I do as well. I find it, I think what I find in my meditation practice now, and I don't do it, I don't practice even every day with it, but I find that what I'm recognizing is that I'll be bound up some days in stress, some days I'll be really clear. And what I've just noticed, and I think that's what I get more in tune with a lot, is just noticing things, but noticing the temporariness of whatever state I'm in, and that these thoughts will pass, and working, I don't know if working's the right word, but choosing not to identify so much with those thoughts.
Yes.
One example of thinking that I've found interesting for me is I will have thoughts. Let's say, I'm a married guy. Let's say that I see an attractive woman, out in town or something, and I have this momentary thought about how beautiful she is. At
Mhm.
one point in my life, I would be like, Jeff, what's wrong with you? You're married. You can't be thinking that way. But yet those thoughts never go away. I see a beautiful, attractive woman, and I notice that and see that. And I think what happens, and I'd be curious what your thought is, Tim, on this, is the danger that we have in those thoughts is that we identify with them and feel like we are the source of them, and we shame ourselves because of them, rather than now I see that thought, I choose not to act on it or to engage with that thought anymore, and I just let it go and I don't identify with it. I love my wife very much. I would never do anything. And so that initial thought, I don't attribute to me. The what I do afterwards, I start to attribute, I guess, to me. I don't know. Does any of that make sense? And do you relate to any of that?
I relate to it completely. I think that I just pretty much totally agree with what you said. It's we can allow our thoughts. We let our thoughts linger by worrying about what we're thinking. But if we learn to take our thinking less seriously, and if we recognize the amount of crap, I guess you would say, that we think each day, or just it's not even crap in reality, but just all the random stuff that we think. Once you become more in tune that that's just a biological function. Like this, we're just going to have all these, input, output thoughts coming and going, and we don't have to take these thoughts so seriously. You see a beautiful woman and you're thinking about how beautiful she is. That doesn't mean that you're going to leave your wife for her. It doesn't mean anything. And of course, when we talk about it in this way, that's obvious, but you'll see throughout the day, or we all see throughout the day, that we have these thoughts that seem so serious at the time. And I mean, really, no thought is that serious unless you keep on dwelling on it. And, we have a tendency to dwell on stuff as opposed to let negative thoughts come and let them go, you know? Um, so yeah, I completely agree with what you're saying. Uh, I'll also just mention that another guide, because I am an editor and writer, so I have a lot of books I can always talk about, and I don't mean to be giving you guys too many book recommendations, but I wrote a guide a couple of years ago called Mindful Manifestation, and I included it an author, a teacher I love named Neville Goddard, who's a famous, I guess you would call him today like a law of attraction teacher. It talks a little bit about his viewpoint on meditation, but Mindful Manifestation, this guide that I published a few years ago, is discussing exactly what we're referencing in terms of meditation and letting your thoughts come and letting them go, and how you can, quote unquote, meditate in a more peaceful and fulfilling way than the former way we were discussing.
Yeah, no, that sounds like a really good, and I appreciate it. I'm always looking to add new book titles to my list of books that I need to check out. I am a big reader, so I'll definitely be checking out these books and also linking to them in the show notes. And I think you made a great segue there for us to talk a little bit about law of attraction. Speaking of books, and I'm not going to remember his name, I'll have to look it up and add it later, but I think David Friedman was his name. He wrote The Thought Exchange. Have you ever heard of David or that book?
I don't know the book. David Friedman, I'm not sure. I don't think the name rings a bell, but I'm not familiar with it.
Yeah, I bring it up because one of the things that he talks about a lot is the law of attraction, which maybe for those out there in just a moment, you can kind of explain what that is. But then I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on this. he talked about manifesting. He also talked a lot about everything that we see in the world is just a mirror of what's on the inside of us. But he made this point that one of the reason that, where law of attraction folks get it wrong a little bit is that they say you'll know you're on the right track when you feel good. And he thought just the opposite. He said, you're on the right track when you don't feel good, when things feel tense and you're worried. And he attributed that to prior life's trauma trying to protect you. When you were going after something that you've never had before, how we get those thoughts. Like, I'll give a good example. I decided this last winter to write my first book. And I did that in about, I think I had it from zero to published in about 30 days, maybe a little less.
Terrific.
About 100 pages. It wasn't a big book. But when I decided to do it, what instantly started showing up in my thoughts was, who are you, Jeff, to be writing a book on how people can have a spectacular life? Nobody's going to want to hear what you have to say. And, all of these thoughts that I think my psyche, my ego was trying to protect me from the possibility that this book might not amount to anything, right? People may not enjoy it, may not find it useful. And so my ego, before I even got out of the gates, trying to shut me down. And so it was giving me all of these thoughts and therefore sensations, nervousness and angst. But what David in his book basically says is, that lets you know you're on the right track. And what you have to learn to do is, those negative sensations, the anxiety, the nervousness, that may not go away. But what you can learn to do is realize that you can tolerate them and take action anyways.
Yes. I like that. I think there's a lot to unpack with the law of attraction. What you're referencing, I would say, is when you are trying, or I shouldn't even use the word trying. If you're utilizing the law of attraction, and you're basically trying to get from point A to point Z quickly, right? By aligning yourself to like a better place mentally. And if the example you gave is a good one, where you're going to be stretching your comfort zone, and that is going to feel, at least at first, extremely uncomfortable. So, in the law of attraction, you constantly hear people say, act as if, and imagine that you are what you want to be. So if you want to be a published writer and you've never written a book, and you're trying to visualize or feel that you are a published writer, and then you start writing the book, and all these doubts and anxieties and feelings of inadequacy are going to come up. And that's just because you're doing something that's out of your comfort zone, and you're going from this place of where you do not have this, to now assuming that you do have it. And that transition mentally and physically is going to, especially at first, there's going to be anxiety. Now, I will say that, generally speaking, when things manifest for us quickly, or how quickly things that we want, the speed at which they manifest often depends on how comfortable we can become allowing them to manifest. Meaning that it must start to feel natural that you are becoming what you want to be. In other words, over those 30 days, it felt more and more natural for you to be a published writer. It felt more and more natural for this book to be out. It felt more and more natural for people for readers to potentially want to read your book. And so you saw it through from the beginning, where there was a lot of discomfort, to the end where there was no discomfort, because it was a relatively little discomfort because the book was out. And now you're a published writer. It's done. You might not even think about it anymore. in the sense of comfort or discomfort. I don't know, maybe you do, but the more natural that you feel about something you desire, the more easily it will come into your life.
You know, I like that, and it makes me think, how important then is alignment and understand, I think about being a natural at something, that's our giftedness and our talents, and being on the path to what we're supposed to do. If do you find that if we're not in alignment with who we naturally are, that discomfort typically doesn't go away, so it is a signal that we're on the wrong path? And that may not be.
Let me let me back up a little bit and say, again, this goes back, everything we're talking about goes together. Okay. And listeners, I think, will understand that anything we're talking about, just take the parts that work for you and disregard the rest. The law of attraction is something that I'm relatively new to myself. I was into spirituality and stress management for a long time before I got into the law of attraction. I only got into the law of attraction like back in 2013 or 2014. But I took to it really quickly. And I read a lot of stuff, and I just want your listeners to know, in my opinion, that there's a huge shortcut is to find the teachers that really resonate with you. So for me, I already mentioned Emile Coué, that book, Self-Mastery Through Conscious Autosuggestion. That book uses no spiritual terms, but that is like one of the best law of attraction books of all time, if not the best, at least of the last 100 years. And Neville Goddard is very famous now in some law of attraction circles. A lot of other people have never heard of him. I've published a bunch of, or republished in a bunch of his books and collections of his works. Just those two guys, and if there's a few other teachers I can name, and I mentioned quite a few of them, I think, in The Joy of Not Thinking. Look at their advice when it comes to the law of attraction, because it will save you a ton of time. I mean, Neville's advice, Neville would say, if you aren't something and it's because of your imagination, he would say you're all imagination. So in other words, if you don't feel aligned, it's because you imagine you don't feel aligned. If you want something badly enough, you will align with it, is what he would say.
Mm.
And in other words, if something doesn't feel natural to you, then that means that something has to change. Either the situation has to change or you have to change. One of his most famous books is called Feeling is the Secret. And the general advice that I give people is feel good and feel relaxed inwardly as much as possible. And that's a very difficult thing to learn to do. But that's the law of attraction, in my opinion. Most of the time, is just learn how to feel better inside, which again goes back to what we were saying earlier.
Yeah, not thinking.
Exactly. Exactly. And so I feel like if you are, to answer your question about what's being aligned, your life's path, in my opinion, you decide. There's no preordained, destiny. You choose your destiny and what you want to do. But if you're doing something and it feels wrong, and it's not just like the initial discomfort that we talked about, where you're changing and there's going to be some discomfort because you're changing, you're transforming. But if it's like a prolonged discomfort, that means that you are something that you should get out of that. You should work inwardly or outwardly on changing the situation so you feel better. Because the more often that you feel better inwardly, then the more good things externally are going to happen to you most of the time, generally speaking.
Yeah, I would very much agree with that statement. Tim, we're coming down towards the end of our hour. A couple of things that I'd want to end with is, one, in addition to being an editor and an author, you also do some coaching, personal coaching. If somebody out there heard what you had to say, they're connecting with you and they wanted to find out more about it, and I'll make sure to put it in the show notes too, but how would they get in touch with you?
Yeah, just go to radicalcounselor.com. Radicalcounselor.com. There's a contact page there. You can also email me at info@radicalcounselor.com.
Awesome. And then just as we're wrapping up, I always like to just see if there's anything that I should have asked you that I didn't, or anything that you wanted to share with the folks in the audience that I might have not have brought out in this conversation.
No, I mean, when it comes to the topics we're talking about, there's nothing to say and there's a bunch to say. It's all the same. So I think that it's important. The only thing I would emphasize is that it's important to trust yourself and to learn to trust yourself and feel better about yourself as much as possible. That's all I ever talk to people about. We just use different words and different teachings to say the same thing, in my opinion. And so, I'm grateful to get to share with you, Jeff, and with your listeners, these ideas, these eternal ideas that we just are trying to bring into focus for ourselves.
Well said. Tim, I really appreciate the time you spent with me this morning. I learned so much from not just your book, The Joy of Not Thinking, but also from our conversation today. It's moved me a lot in terms of getting to, I guess, just a better understanding of who I am and how I show up in the world. And so I appreciate that. And thank you very much for that.
Thank you for having me, Jeff. It was a good hour. It was a fun conversation.
Thanks for listening to the #Lita podcast hosted by Jeff Connor. We hope you are now inspired to say love is the answer. Now go out and change the world.
Tell me you want more.